Pelican Bay sits near the far northern edge of California, where the redwood forests grow thick, the ocean air turns cold, and the land feels distant from the noise of big cities. And that distance is not an accident, because when California built Pelican Bay State Prison, it chose isolation on purpose. A place far from urban centers, far from families, far from distractions, because Pelican Bay was designed for a new kind of incarceration, one that focused less on rehabilitation and more on control, less on reform and more on containment. And from the day it opened its doors in 1989, Pelican Bay carried a different reputation than older prisons, because this wasn't just a prison, it was a Supermax, a facility built to hold the inmates considered the most dangerous, the most disruptive, the ones other prisons struggled to manage, and the message was clear from the beginning: Pelican Bay was where the system sent people it believed could not be handled anywhere else. And over time, that message spread beyond California until Pelican Bay became known across the country as one of the most secure and controversial prisons in America. A place surrounded not just by fences and guard towers, but by stories, lawsuits, protests, and debates about how far a justice system should go in the name of safety. And to understand how Pelican Bay became that symbol, you have to go back to the era that created it, because the 1980s in America were marked by rising crime rates, gang violence, and a political climate that demanded toughness on crime. Voters supported harsher sentences, lawmakers expanded prison construction, and corrections departments faced growing populations of inmates affiliated with prison gangs that operated both inside and outside facilities. And officials argued they needed a new type of prison to manage that threat, a prison built from the ground up with security as the top priority. And so Pelican Bay was designed with modern surveillance, reinforced concrete, electronic doors, and a special unit that would later define its image more than anything else: the Security Housing Unit, known simply as the SHU. And the SHU was not like general population housing, it was a world of its own. A place where inmates spent nearly all day inside single cells, where human contact was limited, where movement was tightly controlled, and where the philosophy centered on minimizing risk by minimizing interaction. And supporters of the model argued that isolating gang leaders could reduce violence throughout the entire prison system, that removing influential figures from communication networks could save lives, and to some extent officials claimed it worked, pointing to drops in certain types of coordinated prison violence. But critics saw something else. They saw men spending years and sometimes decades in near total isolation. They saw psychological strain. They saw a system that might control behavior at the cost of mental health, and those concerns would grow louder as stories from inside Pelican Bay slowly reached the outside world. Because despite the remote location, news still traveled through letters, through lawyers, through families, and through the occasional investigative report that peeled back the layers of secrecy surrounding Supermax confinement. And what people learned often surprised them, because Pelican Bay was not chaotic in the way older prisons were sometimes portrayed. It was controlled, quiet, structured, and that quiet itself became part of the controversy, because silence in a Supermax can mean safety, but it can also mean isolation so deep that time begins to blur. And former inmates would later describe days measured not by clocks but by routines. Meals slid through slots, limited yard time in small concrete enclosures, sometimes called dog runs, conversations shouted through vents or walls. And for those in the SHU, placement could be based on behavior, and also on suspected gang affiliation, which meant validation processes and intelligence gathering played a role. And critics argued that once labeled, an inmate could struggle to return to general population, creating a system where isolation could stretch indefinitely. And lawsuits in the 1990s began challenging conditions, arguing that prolonged solitary confinement raised constitutional questions. And courts examined everything from cell size to access to programs to mental health care. And while some rulings pushed for adjustments, the SHU itself remained, because the broader debate balanced two powerful concerns: The safety of staff and inmates on one side, and the psychological impact of isolation on the other, and Pelican Bay stood right at that intersection, becoming both a model for high-security design and a lightning rod for human rights discussions. And outside the legal battles, the prison developed its own internal culture shaped by routine, policy, and the knowledge among inmates that Pelican Bay was different. That it was a place where influence from the yard mattered less than paperwork, where classification decisions could define daily life, and where the architecture itself limited spontaneous interaction. And correctional officers working there described a job that required vigilance and emotional control, because managing a Supermax environment means paying attention to small details, patterns, and risks that might be invisible elsewhere. And the remote location added another layer. Staff often lived in nearby communities where the prison was a major employer, tying the institution economically to the region, which meant Pelican Bay was not just a correctional facility, but part of the local identity. And as years passed, its reputation grew, mentioned in documentaries, academic studies, and criminal justice courses as an example of the Supermax philosophy in action. A philosophy built on the belief that some individuals require extreme measures to maintain order. Yet, even as that belief held sway in certain circles, the national conversation about incarceration slowly evolved. Research on solitary confinement's psychological effects expanded, advocacy groups organized, and former inmates shared personal accounts that painted a more complicated picture, not simply of punishment, but of endurance, adaptation, and sometimes deterioration. And the question began to surface more often in public discourse, not just whether Supermax prisons could control behavior, but whether they should rely so heavily on isolation to do it. And Pelican Bay became central to that question because of its scale and its visibility in policy debates. And by the early 2000s, it was clear that Pelican Bay was more than a facility on a map. It was a symbol in a larger national argument about how America handles its most challenging inmates, an argument with no easy answers and strong opinions on every side. And still, the prison operated day after day according to its design, counts conducted, doors controlled electronically, movement scheduled precisely. A system built to reduce unpredictability in an environment where unpredictability can be dangerous, and yet human nature does not disappear behind concrete and steel. It adapts, it copes, it reacts. And inside Pelican Bay, each person experienced that environment differently, some focusing on routine to stay grounded, some turning to reading or writing, some struggling with the mental weight of isolation, and some seeing the shoe as a necessary consequence of choices made inside or outside prison walls. And this range of perspectives made the story of Pelican Bay difficult to reduce to a simple narrative of good or bad, because it lived in the gray areas where safety, ethics, policy, and psychology overlap, and as the years moved forward, pressure for review and reform would slowly build, setting the stage for challenges that would test whether the Supermax model could remain unchanged in a changing world. Because no institution exists in a vacuum forever, not even one built for isolation, and Pelican Bay, despite its remote setting and heavy security, was still connected to the laws, values, and debates of the society that created it, and those connections would eventually shape the next chapter of its story. As Pelican Bay moved into the 90s and early 2000s, its reputation as one of America's toughest prisons was cemented. But with that reputation came intense scrutiny. The more a system relies on extreme measures, the more people ask where the limits should be. At Pelican Bay, the focus of that question was the Security Housing Unit, the SHU. This was a place designed for total control. Inmates could spend up to 23 hours a day in their cells with almost no human contact. Officials argued this was necessary to manage gang leaders and those who posed ongoing threats, saying traditional prisons just couldn't handle individuals who could orchestrate violence even while locked up. From a security standpoint, the logic seemed simple. Separate the troublemakers and you reduce trouble. But the human cost of that separation slowly started to come to light. Attorneys, journalists, and advocacy groups gathered testimonies from those who had spent years inside those windowless cells. They described a world defined by routine and restriction. Natural light was a luxury. Meals came through a slot in the door. Recreation often meant stepping alone into a small concrete yard with high walls and just a patch of sky overhead. While these measures were meant to prevent harm, they also created an environment where time seemed to stand still, where days blurred into months and months into years. Psychologists began to pay closer attention, studying the effects of prolonged isolation on the human mind. Severe anxiety, depression, sensory deprivation, and the profound difficulty some faced when trying to return to a social world. These findings didn't solve the security problems, but they raised ethical and medical questions that couldn't be ignored. By the late 2000s, the pressure for reform was building. A key issue was how inmates were placed in the SHU. It could be based on gang validation, things like tattoos, known associations, or even confidential tips. Critics argued this could trap people in isolation without clear behavioral violations. Corrections officials countered that prison gang dynamics are real and deadly, and intelligence-based decisions were vital to preventing violence. This disagreement set the stage for one of the most significant chapters in Pelican Bay's history. In 2011, inmates across several California prisons, led by those in Pelican Bay, organized massive hunger strikes to protest long-term solitary confinement. These strikes grabbed national attention. Participants refused meals for weeks, risking their health to make their voices heard. What was remarkable was the coordination between inmates from rival groups, showing that the issue of isolation transcended typical prison divides. Families rallied outside, advocacy groups amplified their message, and media coverage brought the conditions of Supermax confinement into living rooms across the country. The state was in a tough spot, trying to balance order and safety with growing public concern. Negotiations and policy discussions followed. Over time, California began to reassess its SHU policies. Step-down programs were created, aiming to provide a pathway out of long-term isolation for inmates who met certain behavioral criteria. Supporters saw it as progress, a recognition that indefinite isolation needed careful review. Critics argued the reforms were too little, too late, and some warned that loosening controls could bring back old security risks. Throughout it all, Pelican Bay kept running. Lawsuits challenged the conditions, leading to settlements that brought changes to mental health care and oversight. This showed, once again, how the legal system often drives correctional reform in America. The hunger strikes also left a cultural mark, reminding officials that inmate populations are not passive and that channels of communication always exist, even in the most restrictive environments. As the 2010s progressed, the national conversation on criminal justice reform broadened, and solitary confinement became a recurring topic. Pelican Bay was often used as a case study. Gradually, data, research, and public opinion began to influence policy, shifting the view of Supermax prisons from untouchable necessities to powerful tools requiring oversight and clear justification. For those who eventually transitioned out of the SHU after years of isolation, readjusting to a more social world was a huge challenge. For some, it was a welcome change. For others, it was completely overwhelming. This human reality added another layer to the policy debates, a reminder that these strategies affect real lives, not just statistics. By the early 2020s, Pelican Bay was still a Supermax prison, but it was no longer untouched by reform. Its policies were more scrutinized, its procedures more reviewed, and its role in the justice system more openly debated. The question was no longer whether Supermax prisons should exist, but how they should operate in a system increasingly aware of both security needs and human impact. And Pelican Bay remains at the very heart of that ongoing national conversation, a place where theory meets reality behind concrete walls. Thanks for watching. If you found this look into Pelican Bay's history interesting, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into complex stories. See you next time. Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're journeying into one of the most infamous names in the American prison system, Pelican Bay. For decades, this California Supermax was synonymous with extreme isolation and the harshest conditions. It was built in 1989 to house the worst of the worst, and its Security Housing Unit, or SHU, became a symbol of solitary confinement. For over 20 years, thousands of inmates spent 22.5 hours a day locked in windowless concrete cells with almost no human contact. The philosophy was simple: absolute control through total isolation. This approach was designed to break the power of prison gangs and control violent individuals. But did it work? And at what cost? Critics argued that this extreme isolation amounted to torture, causing severe psychological damage, including hallucinations, paranoia, and depression, without actually making the prisons or the public any safer. The conditions at Pelican Bay didn't just stay behind bars, they sparked a nationwide debate. Then, something unprecedented happened. In 2011 and 2013, inmates inside Pelican Bay organized massive hunger strikes. Tens of thousands of prisoners across California participated, protesting the long-term, indefinite solitary confinement. They weren't just asking for better food or more yard time. They were demanding their basic humanity be recognized. This wasn't a riot with weapons. It was a peaceful protest that captured the world's attention. The sheer scale and organization of these strikes, coordinated from within the most secure units, forced officials to listen. The world was watching, and the pressure was immense. This inmate-led movement became the catalyst for a legal and political firestorm. A class action lawsuit, Ashker v. Brown, was filed, challenging the constitutionality of prolonged solitary confinement. The inmates argued it was cruel and unusual punishment, and the courts started to agree. The lawsuit was a turning point. In 2015, a landmark settlement was reached, effectively ending indefinite solitary confinement at Pelican Bay and across California. The state agreed to dramatically overhaul its policies. No longer could an inmate be sent to the SHU based solely on gang affiliation. Instead, they had to have committed a specific, serious rule violation. The settlement also created a new pathway for inmates to transition out of isolation and back into the general population. This wasn't just a minor policy tweak, it was a revolutionary shift in philosophy. The focus began to move from pure punishment to rehabilitation. Pelican Bay started introducing programs designed to help inmates who had spent years, even decades, in isolation. They created step-down programs offering classes on anger management, restorative justice, and communication skills. It was a massive experiment. Could the men who were once considered too dangerous for human contact be reintegrated? The results have been complex but encouraging. After the reforms, thousands of inmates were released from the SHU, and contrary to fears of a massive spike in violence, the prison system did not collapse. In fact, many correctional officers reported that the new, program-focused environment was safer and less tense. The men participating in these new programs began to change. They started engaging in group therapy, writing, and even mentoring each other. These were men who hadn't spoken to more than one or two people at a time in decades, now learning to live in a community again. Of course, the transition hasn't been perfect. There are still challenges with resources, staffing, and dealing with the deep-seated trauma that both inmates and staff have experienced. The debate about Pelican Bay's role is far from over. Is it a model for reform, or are the changes just a surface-level fix for a fundamentally broken system? Today, Pelican Bay stands as a living testament to the possibility of change within the bleakest of environments. It shows that even the most hardened institutions can evolve when confronted with courage and a demand for human dignity. The story of Pelican Bay is a powerful reminder that how we treat our most marginalized populations says everything about who we are as a society. It forces us to ask tough questions. What is the true purpose of prison? Is it punishment, or is it rehabilitation? The journey of Pelican Bay from a fortress of isolation to a laboratory for reform offers no easy answers, but it provides a crucial and compelling chapter in the ongoing story of American justice. What do you think about these changes? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and if you found this interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives. See you next time.
Deep in the redwood forests of Northern California lies a place whispered about in Fairfulton Hills, and becomes the most with the harshest form of incarceration in America, Pelican Bay State Prison, when it opened its door in tahun 1989. It was not just another prison, it was an experiment. A fortress designed to hold what the system called the worst of the worst. This is the story of how Pelican Bay was created, what love was like inside its wall, and how it forever changed the American prison landscape. Mulai tahun 1980, when a turbulent time for California as correctional system, overcrowding was rampant. Then violence within prisons was spiraling out of control. Gangs held immense power, orchestrating criminal activities both inside and outside the prison walls. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation needed a solution, a way to break the gangs' stronghold and isolate their most influential leaders. Their answer was Pelican Bay, a state of the art 275 acre complex built for one primary purpose, total control, the heart of Pelican Bay. Then its most infamous feature was the security housing unit, or the SHU. Picture this, an exact contrary building where inmates were held in solitary confinement for 22 to 23 hours a day. Their cells were 8 di 10-foot boxes of poured concrete. The bed was a concrete slab, the desk and stool were concrete. The only window was a small square gate or a narrow slit looking onto a concrete wall. There was no direct human contact. Food was delivered through a slot in the door. The only time they left was for a brief period in an individual outdoor cage, often called the dog room. The conditions in the SHU were designed to be psychologically crushing. The goal was to break down the gang leadership, to make life so unbearable that inmates would the brief cut is, renounce their gang affiliation and provide information on other members. For years, this was the reality for thousands of men. The sensory deprivation, the extreme isolation. In the lack of human touch it was a world apart from anything we can imagine. Critics called it torture, a violation of human rights. Proponents argued it was a necessary event to ensure safety in the wider prison system, but something unexpected happened. Instead of breaking, the inmates organized, in tahun 2011 and again in tahun 2013, prisoners across California. Like the inmates in the Pelican Bay SHU, coordinated massive hunger strikes. They weren't just protesting the food, they were protesting the entire system of long-term solitary confinement. Through contraband cell phones and coded messages, they built a collision that transcended racial and gang lines, so making unheard of in the violent world of California prisons. These hunger strikes captured national attention. The world was suddenly looking at Pelican Bay not just as a prison, but as a human rights issue. The inmates' demands were simple, an end to indefinite SHU sentences, better food, and access to meaningful programs. The protests sparked lawsuits and intense public pressure. The impact was profound. In tahun 2015, a landmark legal settlement known as the Survey, Governor of California case, brought about sweeping reform. The state agreed to dramatically limit the use of solitary confinement. No longer called an inmate prison, but the SHU based solely on gang affiliation. The practice of indefinite isolation was effectively ended. Hundreds of inmates who had spent years, even decades, in the SHU were transferred back into the general population. Today, Pelican Bay is a different place, while still a maximum security prison. Its infamous SHU is no longer the vast human warehouse it once was. The story of Pelican Bay is a powerful reminder of the complex debates around punishment, rehabilitation, and human rights. It started as a symbol of ultimate control, but it became a catalyst for change. Forcing a national reckoning with one of the most extreme forms of punishment in the modern world. Its legacy is a testament to the enduring human spirit and the power of collective action, even from inside a comfortable car. Thanks for watching. If you found this story interesting, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into fascinating history. See you next time.